What's up, everyone? This is your host, Rem Ortega, and welcome to the Pivot Chronicles Podcast, a show where we learn how shifting in life can lead to success. If you want to share your own story, go to thepivotchronicles.com. For now, listen in and enjoy! You know what the end of the year means? Holidays, yes, but it's also podcast performance review time. Yay. I'm probably the only one getting excited about analytics, but doing the unsexy stuff is what we do. We looked at some of the analytics of the podcast I was working with and learned a ton. So if you're planning to launch your podcast this 2024, here are some of the things that we learned that could help you prepare for next year. Number 1, use Spotify podcast updates that matter. I have 4 things here, and the first one is Anchor.fm is merged with Spotify and is now Spotify for podcasters. So in case you didn't know, before we can only view analytics on Spotify for podcasters account, but since the merge, we're now able to have the features of Anchor.fm inside of it, meaning you can upload your show on here and distribute it using the RSS feed for free. Of course, free stuff, they have limitations, but that's a topic for another day. Second thing, timestamps on Spotify podcast episodes. Another one of my favorite feature that Spotify has is the timestamps, or as they call it, chapters. So if you're an avid podcast listener, you know that each episode can take 30 minutes to 1 hour or even longer than that. And timestamps can really help out to navigate, especially if there are parts that you want to go back to. So you can check this article to know how to add timestamps for your episode, and that link will be in the show notes. Also, this is only available for the Spotify app. Third thing, auto-transcription for podcasts. As a visual learner, I really like the lyrics auto-generated and in sync as I listen to music on Spotify. And now, podcasts will have it too on top of their timestamps, so it's easy to follow along each episode. The feature may not be available for all podcasts yet though, because they only rolled out last September 2023. Fourth, and the last point for this section is uploading your podcast as a video on Spotify. So your listeners can now view your podcast as a video right on the Spotify platform. But this feature is only limited to Spotify exclusive podcasts only, like Call Her Daddy. If you check out their show, you will see that you can only watch the full video in Spotify because it's just exclusive there. And actually, you can upload a video in your Spotify for podcasters account, but then your podcast will not appear on other platforms if you uploaded a video version of it to your RSS. Okay, let's go to number 2. How about Apple Podcasts? What are the updates, right? So we discovered that Apple Podcast is still the top podcast platform being used by users of the podcasts that we're working with. So they are under the business and entrepreneurship category. And according to their demographics data, the top listening platform being used by their listeners or audience are Apple Podcasts. And it's really ironic how this data came from Spotify for podcasters itself. Okay, let's go to number 3. Did AI take over podcasting? I know there's a lot of buzz around AI this year. 2023 is like an AI year, but my short answer is not really. But let's talk about the advantages first, okay? So AI is a great leverage for your podcast process. Some tools can now cough out show notes, clips, and edit your audio in just one click, which will save you a ton of time. Some of these tools are PodSqueeze, Capsho, and Riverside. Riverside auto-generates clips from your full episodes now, and it can also generate your show notes. But those features are on a higher paid subscription tier, so we gotta pay to get those advanced features. Another tool though is Descript. So if you've seen some of my videos in the past, you will see that I've been talking about Descript as my favorite podcast tool because it has the studio sound feature that lets you clean up the audio in just one click. And now it has the text-to-speech AI that can learn your voice, This is very useful, especially if you've prepared your content in a script and you can just plug it in the script and let it run, right? It will transform your written content into a full-blown podcast episode using your voice as the audio. Do we even have to record anymore? So if you're just doing audio for your podcast or even just fixing it, this will really help a lot. Now, there's a caveat though, and you have to be careful because with tech like these, scammers can potentially use your voice to trick your loved ones if it gets to the wrong people. This is why the script will get your consent first before using your voice. If you want to learn more about what these tools are and how to use them, then you can read my blog about AI tools that can 10x your podcast production productivity. The link will be in the show notes. Going back to why I think AI didn't really take over podcasting is that despite all the hype going around, we can't deny the fact that the current AI developments are just not at a level where we can 100% leave all the work to it and everything in the podcast process will be automated. Heck, it can't even draw hands, But some podcasters are doing it though. Like in this podcast group that I was in, a member shared how they are fully automating everything on their news podcast, even the recording. But after checking it out and listening to it, it's so obvious that the voice is AI and it's kind of taking away from the authentic experience. ChatGPT also got dumbed down. Developers impose a lot of limitations to prevent illegal activities, but that also means that there are more limitations for normal users like us. And most AI can only take data from years back, like from 2021. Which is why I couldn't let AI write this episode for me because it's what to look out for this 2024. So it's real. One thing AI sure can't replace is experiences. And that's what makes up life. That's what makes your show valuable. So go ahead and share that. Number 4. Here's another thing that you should look out for this 2024. Google Podcasts will be removed in 2024 because Google will be focusing on integrating podcasts to YouTube. So, if you're starting a podcast in 2024, it's better to make sure that you're recording a video and to add a podcast playlist as well on YouTube. So, in case they take it to the next level, aka pushing podcasts and YouTube music, because that's likely going to happen, it's going to be easy for your listeners or your viewers to navigate. And in case you don't know how to do that, I included the link in the show notes so you can check it out. Finally, let's talk about what these all mean for you. How can you plan your podcast if you want to launch at least by Q1 of 2024, let's say? So I have 5 tips and be sure to take notes because you will need this. Alright, number 1, prepare everything before the launch. Your intro, your outro, mid-rolls, your ads, if you have any, your background music, your topics, your podcast description, and your podcast artwork. You also need to figure out where you will host your podcast. So like for example, Spotify for podcasters is free, so you can use that as you get started. But of course, it has limitations, and you might want to check out other podcast hostings if you want, like Buzzsprout, Libsyn, or Megaphone if you are planning to do ads in the future. But those are paid podcast hosting platforms. But please have clarity first and do your research before you jump into opting for a podcast hosting. And anyway, in the future, if you decide to use a paid podcast hosting platform, it's not too late. It's still possible to migrate your podcast data to your new hosting platform. And also, you have to think about each phase, right, in the podcast process. So there is the pre-production process, which is the planning stage, your production process, or your production phase, which is your recording stage, your post-production phase, which is your editing, and then your publishing phase, which is launching or scheduling your podcast episodes, and then promoting your show through social media. If you want a checklist on that, I'll include a free guide in the show notes, so be sure to check it out as well. Alright, second tip. Record your episodes ahead. At least 2 weeks or 1 month advance would be great to ensure you will not miss an upload schedule and to give ample time for post-production, especially if you're the one editing your show. record with a video format, period. With the rise of AI tools nowadays, and once the tech gets even better, it's going to be more challenging to distinguish which is real. So you've got to put yourself on video to make that podcasting experience for your audience more real and more authentic. All right, number 3. Start strong and have your most famous guests be the first episodes to launch. This will help your podcast rank higher right off the bat and have the chance to appear in the new and noteworthy section of Apple Podcasts. Number 4, create templates. As you go along producing and publishing episodes, you will quickly realize how repetitive the process is. So create email templates to contact your guests, show notes templates, podcast artwork templates, graphics, and video templates. Number 5, set your launch date. This is very important to make sure that you get your podcast out because you have other things to do, right? You have a lot of things going on in your life. Maybe you have a full-time job or a business to run and, a lot of other things. So you have to prepare time and bandwidth to record your episodes and get your podcast running. So after you've set your launch date, from here, you can put a timeline because typically preparation can take 3 to 4 weeks for a 1 episode per week podcast or 4 episodes per month podcast if you're not sprinting it. And as I've mentioned earlier, you have a lot of other things to do as well. So we got to make sure that there's enough time for you to go through all of those podcast phases. Okay? So those are the 5 tips to help you prepare your podcast for 2024. And that's it for now. I hope this episode helps you out. And if you have more questions, feel free to drop me a DM on Instagram. And I'll see you next time. Happy podcasting! Thank you for listening to the Pivot Chronicles Podcast. If you want to share your own story, go to thepivotchronicles.com. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So connect with me on Instagram at rem_ortega_. I'm looking forward to talking with you. See you in the next episode.